Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everyone, you are listening to Audiobookish. My name is Fahad Rahman, and as always I'm joined by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And this is the first in our specials reviewing the books for the British Book Awards 2026 Book of the Year Audiobook Fiction, and the full shortlists for the books in that category are Beautiful Ugly, Cursed Daughters, One of Us, Pride and Prejudice, The Long Shoe, and The Rosefield. And today we're going to be discussing Beautiful Ugly and Cursed Daughters. I will read out the blurb for Beautiful Ugly. So here we go. So Beautiful Ugly by Alice Feeney, as narrated by Richard Armitage and Tuppance Middleton. Wives think their husbands will change, but they don't. Husbands think their wives won't change, but they do. Author Grady Green is having the best day of his life. Grady calls his wife as she's driving home to share some exciting news. He hears Abby slam on the brakes, get out of her car, then nothing. When he eventually finds the car by the cliff edge, the headlights are on, the driver's door is open, her phone is still there, but his wife has disappeared. A year later, Grady is still overcome with grief and desperate to know what happened to Abby. He can't sleep and he can't write, so he travels to a tiny Scottish island to try and get his life back on track. Then he sees the impossible, a woman who looks exactly like his missing wife. Okay, so I have thoughts about this book. Before I get into my mini tirade, what I'm going to say, and this is probably going to give away much about what I actually think about the book. I can understand why this book is nominated, why it is on the shortlist, purely on the strength of the narration and the sound design. In terms of the actual text of the books, this I just thought it was like nonsense. Really, I just thought the entire thing relied on so many far-fetched, nonsensical kind of like plot devices, plot holes. It kind of like surfs away on like vibes. Do you know what I mean? So I can understand in terms of Alice's writing. She's really great at setting like an atmosphere in terms of like, you know, kind of creating this like creeping fear and doubt about whether what's happening is real or not real, whether they're supernatural elements, whether they're not supernatural natural elements. And she does a good job of kind of setting the scene in terms of whether Grady's like mental capacities are playing tricks on him and stuff like that. We can't really talk about it fully without giving like massive spoilers, and I don't want to do that because I appreciate this is like a book awards episode, but the ending left me, if I had a book in my hand, I would have thrown it across the room at the end of it. So that's like what I overall feel about it before we kind of get into specifics. I was just wondering if that kind of chimed in with what you felt about it.
Yeah, I think so, really. Like I definitely think kind of the caliber of the casting
Yes.
Obviously I think is a big reason why it is being highlighted as a good example of audio, and I think there's definitely a lot of good to say about those performances. I felt that Richard Armitage was almost, now I'm a fan of Richard Armitage and definitely think he's a great actor, but I thought this was an odd choice for how I would interpret the character, and certainly the way the character presents himself.
Yes.
He's almost too cool and too edgy for this very like unassuming character.
I would completely agree with that. Sorry to cut across. I think Richard Armitage is too charismatic, too charming, too sexy.
Yeah.
And I just felt, you know, Grady Green, as I felt that he was written on the page, was very nebbish, very needy. Would probably sound closer to what I sound like with my blocked nose at the moment. Yeah, I found Grady a very difficult character to get along with. Which can, you know, you don't always need to have a character you like in the book, but when that is your main narrator, you do need some sort of hook there, and I agree with what you were saying, that the way Richard performs that role is he's just way too cool and charismatic, I think.
Yeah. No, that was what I thought. And it's interesting what you say there about the needing a hook for characters even if you don't like them, because I think we'll come back to that when we're discussing more of the shortlist from stuff that I've listened to. But yeah, exactly. That was sort of what I thought. But something that I did think was interesting about it, and means, you know, it's not necessarily in any way a wrong casting decision, especially because obviously the name and caliber of narrator is always going to help your audiobook anyway. But I did think that it set, the way he reads it, you know, it does set a very dark tone for the book.
Yes.
And I kind of found myself that in the earlier chapters, if I were just reading it, I could be convinced this was a much lighter book. Now, I know that seems odd, given that it opens with his wife has disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but it almost, the way it's written, feels like that is kind of just the backstory for this writer going on a journey with his writing, is kind of how you could read, I think, the print of a lot of the content until it starts getting more creepy. And therefore, I think having him read it in a much more mysterious way does set that sort of psychological thrillery tone thing more. And so, I don't know, if we'd have had a voice that suited more the way the character's written early on, would that have actually been a disservice to the book and its themes and its tone overall, maybe?
Yeah. There is one reason why I think Richard Armitage does work particularly well, and that's to contrast him with basically the book is split into character chapters. So we'll have some chapters narrated by Grady Green, Richard Armitage, and then the other chapters will be narrated by Abby, which is Tuppance Middleton. Now, I will say it takes a fair amount to kind of scandalise me, but there is like one of Abby's chapters does, like, it did scandalise me, kind of describing the first meeting between Abby and her husband.
Yeah.
And I just felt, okay, I could understand Richard Armitage being able to pull that off without getting into too many gross and lewd details about how that meeting occurred. And if it was someone slightly more like nebbish, then I don't think that necessarily would have worked as well. So I think that's maybe a reason why he was cast, apart from being obviously, I mean, his voice is so listenable to. Do you know what I mean? So yeah.
I'm going to try and not spoil it, but I remember at that scene thinking that didn't seem like the person that we were being presented with, and I was hoping that would be rationalized as the story went on, and then it did.
Yeah,
that particular twist at the end that rationalizes that, I didn't see coming and was very happy about. I think it is sometimes a bit difficult to then go back and iron everything out and to separate it into the different sections. So I think that was maybe asking a bit too much of us. But I did love that twist. I didn't see that twist coming, and I'm glad that it answered my questions about that scene that you just described. But I did kind of, I guess, connected to that particular twist I was very happy about. A lot of the others were quite predictable.
Just to kind of like build on what you're saying there, I think the twist only works if Richard Armitage is narrating.
Right.
Yeah. If it's someone a little bit more nebbish.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you see what I mean?
No, I see. Like, I do exactly see what I mean. Yeah. But that's what I mean, is that it flagged to me.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that. So the way Abby describes beating her husband, when I was first listening to it, I thought, this is like a tale of two unreliable narrators with different perspectives about how their lives would go. Because the way that, she sees her husband and the way Grady Green is like described, you just think, who are these? How, what's going on? And that does resolve. Later on, and like a lot of my discussion that I was having until that it is resolved was me going to be talking about that. But in terms of, because I think the strongest part of the book is like the narration and the sound design. I really like the things they did around the musical stings and the use of walkie-talkies. I thought that was kind of quite clever, and the occasional use of atmospheric sound design, so like wind and stuff like that. I felt it was used very sparingly, and I felt that was because you can overdo it and then it does become a little bit of like a radio play, but I think they picked and chose their moments to to put in those
Mm.
elements. I was wondering how you felt that they worked, or whether they were overplayed, or if you would wanted to see a little bit more of that.
Yeah, no, I think I really liked those as well. And yeah, I think kind of in general, the level was good. You know, they didn't force a lot of sound design in to make it like an immersive radio play. Neither did they, you know, not have any. I thought that was quite a nice balance of stuff. When you go really granular, I had put in here, like, interesting how they decide when to or not to do the walkie-talkie crackle. I think there was a moment where it said the walkie-talkie crackled and there wasn't one. Now, whether that was just one that was missed or whether that was an intentional decision is, I guess, what, you know, my question in my notes was, is that I'd be interested to know that, because it wasn't necessarily always the same. But yeah, in terms of, like, zooming out, overall picture, certainly I think that was a really good balance of occasional sound effects, atmospheric noises. I thought the church bells were really good and really heightened the emotional intensity of that moment. I thought in terms of SFX that, yeah, the production on the audio was really, really good. I did have, while we're on the audio quality, I did have 3 instances of rough edits. Like 2 instances where the sentences are clipped, and I actually genuinely don't know what the end of the sentence was, because it cuts from the middle of one sentence to the middle of the other, or I think it clips a line and then there's a bit of silence and then something comes in. And then another instance is less bad, but it was clicky and there's a really overly long pause. So they just feel like just editing errors that have got missed somewhere in the process. And I fully appreciate that it is difficult to catch everything. I guess I'm just slightly disappointed that, especially with this being something that's clearly been nominated for awards, as in, you know, the publishers put it up for them, as well as it making a shortlist and stuff like that. Fair enough if it had been missed originally. I do think it's a bit of a shame that at the time of me listening to it, and we were listening to the version on Google Play, disappointed that those haven't been fixed. Again, I understand that, especially when you've got celebrity narrators, if you're missing lines and if they are gone, then getting them re-recorded is especially difficult and expensive.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a disservice to the audio listeners to have bad edits in general, but especially to have bits of words missing, like bits of sentences missing, bits of actual content. Do you know what I mean? So I do think it's a bit of a shame that they haven't been fixed, because that does impact the experience. And as I say, yeah, it's just, I guess it's just my general gripe with the audio industry, that I'm finding more and more mistakes like this are just allowed to keep in, and I just think that's a real shame. So yeah, that's my slight gripe about the audio production, but the audio production in terms of SFX and stuff like that was really, really good.
So let's talk a little bit about the story. So Grady Green, he's this sort of successful author. His wife has gone missing. He ends up on this island as a way of maybe re-kickstarting his career and start writing again. So I had a little bit of sympathy with him because his wife has gone missing. He needs a little bit of time to build himself back up. I felt the story took a little bit, maybe too long to get going. The action doesn't really start until we end up on the island with its colourful cast of characters. I was just wondering, in terms of like the characters of the island, if you had any particular favourites.
Maybe less that, but certainly I wanted to pull up on something that you mentioned earlier about when on the island, they do a good job of kind of not making it clear whether it's, you know, his mind playing tricks or actual things happening and stuff like that. It reminded me of a Jonathan Creek episode that really stuck with me that I watched when I was younger, where there is this kind of elaborate plot of illusions, as kind of Jonathan Creek does, but is this very much of kind of like you see them out of the corner of your eye and then the next time you look they're gone, and is that the person I think it is, or is that someone else who just looks a bit like them? That it made me think of that, which I quite liked. But yeah, I don't know, really. I think there's a lot to like about a lot of the characters. It's more just kind of that by the end the story gets, it's a combination of both. It gets very messy, but then also it's kind of overly explained. I definitely, you know, early on I was finding myself like, okay, I'm actually pretty tense and I'm pretty intrigued as to, okay, what is real, what isn't, why is this happening, what's going to happen next? But then the end goes on for a long time. And there's a lot of explanation and more. There's a lot of, I've put here kind of, there's a lot of teasing lines of, but what happened next meant this. And I have to tell him finally. And I'm just like, yeah, so do it then. get on with it. There was definitely, as you got further on, the building of tension became a bit too, I'm trying to build tension here rather than actually building tension, and I did find myself frustrated. And then, when the reveal finally actually comes, it happens in 7 steps because it doesn't actually do it all those times. A lot of stuff's repeated. Yeah, sorry, I think I've got a bit off topic of the question that you asked, but yeah.
I mean, kind of where I was trying to get to was basically Grady's main antagonist in the story for a large part. Well, I felt that was one of his main antagonists through the story was the island's sheriff Sandy, who she's sort of his guide, but also a warning figure to him as well. Yeah, I was just wondering, kind of in terms of that relationship where he's kind of trying to discover more, and she's sort of like withholding, and he's trying to find this information out about the island, about whether his missing wife is there or not. And I was just wondering how you felt that cat and mouse relationship played out.
Yeah, I think it was quite interesting, and I think the dynamic of, her wanting to protect the island and a very much kind of the islanders and the outsiders dynamic that's set up, that she very much is almost the most one protecting that divide, even though she also does extend branches across, suggesting he uses Charles's car and various things like that. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And then I guess that's part of it being such an interesting one is the ethical dilemmas that Grady feels he is facing. The fact that he finds those difficult decisions is obviously very telling of his character. But I think that's the thing. I think the fact that they build up a friendship then means that when he makes that decision, you have a very clear idea of what you think of him as a person.
Yeah, yes. Okay, I will mention one detail that did wind me up about the island, just in terms, and sometimes like a small thing can be mentioned in a book and it just completely takes you out of your suspension of disbelief. Mm-hmm. And that's when they mentioned that the island doesn't have any birds. And I'm just kind of like coming from like an ecological, like environmentalist point of view, it's just kind of like the island would be overrun with like bugs. So just kind of like, okay, you're talking about trying to right the wrongs in the natural world and all that sort of things. But I think that's probably the point in the book where he feels like he's seeing ghosts and stuff in the trees and the forests are surrounding his cabin. And he noticed that the woods are really quiet. And he asks Sandy about, well, I noticed there's no like bird songs, and she mentions there's the reason why there are no birds there. I just thought, oh, this is just a bit silly now, isn't it? She's and you just feel like that at that point that the book lost me there.
Fair. I mean, I don't really know enough about the biology and kind of I'm forgetting the word now, but for habitats and stuff as to know how the likelihood behind things like that. I think the things that took me out of it were, as I say, as well as that sort of, I felt like I was being too much tension was being created for me intentionally. That took me out of it. And also, like, I felt like there were a few kind of continuity errors that didn't quite work, of things like, would Grady know that? And how, wait a minute, when did this guy die? And how old was he? And I don't think that seems quite consistent. And there was just a few things that just didn't seem like great in continuity. And similarly, that stuff about repeating, the writing in that kind of copy edit line was maybe missing some extra refinement or extra time to kind of go over those things, and it was more that kind of stuff that I found did take me out of it a bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of plot holes I felt in the book where I just thought that it just doesn't work. Right, final thoughts on the book. Like I said, I think I understand why it's been nominated. I think Richard and Tuppence do like a really, really good job with, I think, quite rough material to make kind of an engaging, listenable to book. But I had like big problems with the text, and I just didn't get on with the story itself. But from a sound design perspective and a narrator's kind of like performance perspective, I understand why it's on the shortlist.
Yeah, I think I would say, I didn't massively get on with the story. I don't think it was so much for me. And I do have some reservations about the writing and editing and how that was put together. But I do really want to praise it for that big Abby twist. I really did like that, and I really do like books that make me go back and reframe stuff that I thought I knew earlier on.
I didn't like it, but I can understand why you did.
Sure.
I think I was just fed up with the book at that point.
That's fair,
like,
and
I
think that was the one thing that, because I was fed up by that point, I'll be honest, but I think that did redeem it for me. So that's a praise that I definitely want to give for that book, for the author, for that. And then, audio-wise, really disappointed by those significant errors, but loved the performances. I felt there were maybe times where you could tell that it was kind of the first read through, and I think you especially get that with celebrity narrators because they're possibly not doing as much prep as your full-time narrators are doing, and so sometimes maybe they are seeing those sentences for the first time. There were just a few tiny little awkward bits, but I am being super picky there. I do think that both performances were really, really good. I thought the accents were really good. I do think Richard kind of had one Scottish woman voice, but I enjoyed it, and yeah, there was so much emotion in the characters on both sides, so I thought they were really good, and I thought, yeah, SFX-wise, the choice of levelling for that was really good, and it really enhanced the experience listening in audio, definitely.
Cool, so let's move on to Cursed Daughters. Do you want to read out the blurb for that one?
Yes, so, Cursed Daughters by Oyinkan Braithwaite, narrated by Weruche Opia, Yekinni, and Nnei Opia Clark. No man will call your house his home, and if they try, they will not have peace. So goes the family curse, long handed down from generation to generation, ruining families and breaking hearts. And now it's Nnei's turn, who, due to her uncanny resemblance to her dead aunt Monife, is already used to her family's strange beliefs, as well as their insistence that she is a reincarnation. Still, when she falls in love with the handsome boy she saves from drowning, she can no longer run from her family's history. Is she destined to live out the habitual story of love and heartbreak, or can she escape the family curse and the mysterious fate that befell her aunt?
I like this book quite a lot.
Great.
I really enjoyed listening to it. As opposed to Beautiful Ugly, I could see why this was nominated on both the strength of its narration, the sound design, and kind of the quality of the storytelling as well. I think this is a really strong contender. Not having listened to the other books on the shortlist, there's so many different bits I wanted to get kind of like get into about the book. Because we started with like the strength of the narration with Beautiful Ugly, I think it's probably a fair place to start here with Cursed Daughter. So again, we've got multiple narrators taking on point of view character chapters. So we've each section or each chapter is told from the point of view of a particular character, and a narrator will take on those duties. I quite liked I don't know if she's not my favorite character, but I really enjoyed the chapters that were from Monife's point of view. Just something about her sections, her character, the way that it was narrated really struck a chord with me. I'm not saying that the other point of view characters didn't, but there was something about the spirit of her character that I really liked. She was at points deeply frustrating, but then you could kind of completely understand why she felt the way she feels, and then why she does the things that she does, and then kind of like the nature of her infatuation with Golden Boy. That's the other thing that these two, Beautiful Ugly and this book, have in common, is kind of like how sort of wretched and useless the male characters are. I think that's probably a common thread in these two books. And the other thing, that there is another similarity in terms of we're not too sure how real the supernatural elements are in the book. So yes, I was just wondering if you had a view on how real the supernatural elements were in the book.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I don't necessarily have like strong conclusions, so I'll just sort of ramble my thoughts, because I think when it opens with quite a supernatural tone, and then we don't get much supernatural for basically the rest of the book, but we do get other people's perspective on whether things are real or not, whether curses are real or not, whether they're the things that Mama G suggests doing are going to work or not. Things like that is sort of then where it is, but it is very much set in, our world rather than it being magical. And I think a part of me initially was a bit disappointed, just because I felt partly just because I like things that are magical and mystical and fantasy and stuff like that, just in general. And reading that opening, I thought, maybe we'll be getting some of this. I've read books with sort of similar mythology and stuff before that I found really interesting. So I guess I was a bit disappointed to not have them. But actually, I did really like the story as it was. It just wasn't what I had expected from the prologue. And so actually I really liked it, and that it didn't do too much of that. I actually quite liked the balance. But then I really, really liked the epilogue. And now I won't spoil anything, but I did like that it returned to that same tone as the opening. And so I liked it in that magical sense. And I really liked what happens in the conclusion of that and how it wraps up this curse and what we think about this curse. And I really liked that. So I liked it, A, in terms of what you're asking about the magic. I'm glad we returned to that in a sort of mystical world. And I also, just as talking about endings, because if people have listened to this podcast before, you know that I'm very hard to please when it comes to endings. And I'll be honest, if you finished it on the chapter, I was not happy with the ending. But then with the epilogue, I was happy with the ending. And so I really liked that it turned me around and it made me go, oh, actually, I really liked that.
It's interesting you say, because I felt there were enough supernatural elements sprinkled throughout the book to kind of make you question whether or not it is real, because Benifei's ghost or her spirit kind of like does appear to characters throughout the story.
Yeah, true, there is a lot of that, yeah.
I mean, in some ways it is like a ghost story, so it does kind of like carry those elements of having the characters question whether or not, you know, the spirit is there or not.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important part of it, yeah.
I think my overall impression, just with kind of the amount when those things are mentioned, I think kind of what I mean is that it could be rationalized as within this world. You know,
Yeah.
there were times where it could be either due to grief or it was literally within dreams and stuff like that. So I felt like there was enough where you could easily say this is within our world, and some people believe in ghosts and some people believe in supernatural, but it is but this is just kind of the truth of our world. Whereas kind of more the, again, I don't know if it's the right word, but that kind of tone thing, that mystical tone of the first and the end,
Yes,
I felt was missing, which initially disappointed by, but actually I quite liked the realistic tone of the main content of the book.
Yes. So the main story, it's set in Lagos, Nigeria. It's almost entirely a cast of female characters, mothers and daughters and sisters and cousins. They are the kind of like the main heart of the story. So we've got Benifei and Ibn, and other main character is Nnei, and she is Ibn's daughter, and a lot of people seem to think that she is the reincarnation of her aunt Benifei, and the curse of the book comes from, is it their grandmother or their great grandmother that was cursed?
I think it's quite a long line up. I'm not sure exactly how far, but yeah, a long way up.
Yeah, so one of their maybe their great grandmother or great grandmother was cursed by a wife of a husband that they shared, basically, and the curse was, none of the women in your family will ever settle down with a man that they love. And I think that kind of like, it kind of sets off to this sort of generational trauma, whether it's caused by genuine supernatural causes or whether that's caused by people believing in supernatural causes, or later on in the book, Nnei, she wants to work in like genetics, and she explores this idea of whether or not this is the way I understood what she was saying, so maybe I'm not getting this right, is the way that the kind of like the stories that we kind of like tell ourselves can kind of like set off certain like genetic triggers that cause us to kind of like behave in certain ways, or like makes us more susceptible to certain hormonal triggers. Whether or not the curse is real or not, its effects can be real whether you believe in it or not. There is this tension in the book between tradition and moving into the modern world, which I found really interesting. I think especially even at her relationship with Nnei, in terms of her not wanting her daughter to have to deal with any of this like nonsense around the curse, or dealing with like magic and stuff like that. You mentioned what's the name of the
Mama G, I think.
Mama G, kind of like her not wanting to do anything to do with Mama G at all. I was just wondering how you felt about those kind of like those elements of traditional beliefs playing at kind of, as you mentioned, kind of like rationality and like the modern world.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. And I liked how, the three perspectives over the three different times, how that changes things. And also, I think especially like there's those three characters whose POV we get, but then there's the two mothers above them whose POV we don't get directly, but they are present in all three strands of the story. And so it feels very much like a 5-character book, more so than a 3-character book, because we get to know them so well. And then, yeah, it's that generational divide. You know, you've then got the 3 generations and their 3 different thoughts on it. But as well, not just generation, you know, because those two mothers, them being sisters, have very different views themselves. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And I think that's partly why I liked the fact that the main story wasn't too magical and fantastical, because we were talking about it in real world terms, and how these beliefs are very important for some people, and for other people they really want to distance themselves from those beliefs. And it can be very helpful for some people to try everything they can to try and fix things, and others say, oh no, that's not science, we're not sticking to that. And I thought, yeah, I really liked that the main section was set in the real world, because I thought there was a really just interesting study of real people, how they react to things, how families differ in their feelings, how the relationships are strained by that. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
The other thing that I found quite interesting was about the tribal stuff that comes into it. So I'm not that aware of like the different tribes in like Nigeria, but when Nnei is courting Golden Boy, or his name's Kalu, one of the main reasons that at least Kalu's family is using for why they shouldn't be together is that they're from 2 different tribes and they've got different traditions and stuff like that. And really, that shit shouldn't matter. Do you know what I mean? But like it does as well, because like coming from 2 different backgrounds and traditions does affect things in a way perhaps it shouldn't do. Yeah,
there was an interesting moment when the youngest generation think that they're above those stereotypes, and then realize actually they are embedded in there, from stuff they've heard and stuff like that. And that was quite interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's the other reason why I enjoyed Nnei's point of view chapters so much, because she does seem to be like so full of life, like her love for like Golden Boy, and kind of actually her genuine love for her whole family, I think really comes through the books. And I was like really struggling to understand like how she would have come to the point at the start of the book to kind of like take her own life. And I was just, so that for me was a really like intriguing, fascinating journey to go on, because you're too strong a character to take this decision. And then there was, we can't get into spoilers too much. There was something that I thought that Eben did, she ended up not doing, but then I feel like we need to do like a mini episode at the end just to discuss the book in terms of spoilers, because I feel like I'm like rambling on like nonsensically. And because you touched on it in your review of Beautiful Ugly, were there like any editorial mistakes in terms of like the sound design and the narration that you noticed in this one?
I felt in terms of audio, I thought it was quite a noisy recording. It was quite clicky and tappy at a lot of points. But other than that, certainly not as egregious as the mistakes I thought there were in the other one. And similar praise for the SFX use. A very similar decision of the level of immersion that they wanted to use, and kind of, more just chapter stings and occasional atmospheric stuff that I thought was quite good, and elevated it and makes it a good reason for it to be on the audio shortlist. And then, in terms of the narration as well that you mentioned at the start, 3 different perspectives. I think that's something that is a real benefit to listening to this book in audio, because they're 3 good performances. I do think there was some areas where maybe the narrators felt a little bit less experienced, where you could kind of tell they were reading rather than performing, but only in small areas. And again, I am being really picky. But I did mostly enjoy their performances. I didn't love, just small criticisms, I didn't love the voice for Ebon's character in Monife's perspective. It was really like whiny and grating, and I did not like it at all.
It's really tricky when you're narrating a character voice that's narrated by another narrator sometimes. So I understand why you say that.
There's the general like consistency thing, because it doesn't really then match up with the other bits, especially because there are moments of Monife's perspective that are pretty much the same time as is set from everyone's perspective, and so it was very odd to have their voices be so different there. But as well, like, okay, even when we first start, she's 11, and so you kind of go a kiddie voice, okay. Even in that case, I found it quite a grating voice. But then when she's 20, it really doesn't seem like the right voice for it. It seems far too childish, and yeah, I wasn't a big fan of that. But that is not necessarily a wrong thing, that's more a personal preference thing. But then there was bits where there were like cries of outrage, and I don't think they were great because they felt really whispered, and it felt to me like the narrator was trying really hard to not blow out the mic, so they weren't actually shouting.
Yeah.
And this for me is where I think like the producer needs to say, no, wait a minute, we'll change the levels, do the shout, and change it back again, because I think it did affect the performance. It certainly affected my listening of it, because I felt so taken out of it when there were those cries, because those cries didn't feel full of emotion. And it was a shame, because I felt like the narrator had that emotion in them and wanted to perform those lines, but they were just really weird when trying to do it whispered, when it wouldn't have been, and it certainly wasn't written to be whispered. So yeah, really picky things that I did note down about the narration. But overall, I really enjoyed the narration, and I really liked that it was 3 separate people. It's a really tricky one because it's really not a one-size-fits-all when things are split perspective as to whether you need multiple narrators or not. I really liked it in this one, A, because I enjoyed listening to the 3 narrators anyway, and also I felt because you are jumping around between them a lot, and because they are a very similar age in all the perspectives, they're like all 20s at the same time, I did find that as I was getting to the end of the book that I think if I was reading it in print, I might, and this is probably more on me than it is on the book, but I think I would have found myself getting a bit, wait a minute, which event happened to which character, and getting a little bit confused. Whereas something that's nice about having it in audio is that, I'm able to employ other faculties, so I could think, oh yeah, that was that voice that told me about that event. And I felt like I was able to segment the perspectives of the story better in my memory from having heard it with 3 different narrators than I would have done from having read it.
So, I mean, the other relationship dynamics in the book that I found really interesting was the relationship between Kemi and Bumi, kind of Grandma East and Grandma West. And then, like, I really loved the bickering dynamics that they sometimes had, kind of like sniping at each other and then looking to support one another as well. I think for me, one of the most touching points in the book was like towards the end where both Nnei and Ibn are in crisis, but they're finding it so difficult to kind of like reach out to each other for support because it's been so long since they've had that kind of like close-knit relationship. And I felt that was like, I mean, there's lots of parts of the book that I think are beautifully written, and I think for me it's just like really beautifully noticed. And then the other thing I wanted to kind of like touch on is this book is really specific to kind of like Nigerian culture and customs, but these like the characters in this book I feel like are fairly universal. You've got the bickering grandmothers, you've got the cousins that don't necessarily get along as well as they should, even though they love each other quite a lot. You've got boyfriends that could be doing a lot better. So I felt that there was even though this is really specific to like Nigeria, there's a lot of universality in the story that it's trying to tell. And if you can't tell by now, I really enjoyed the book, and I will be kind of like seeking out other books that this author has written as well. So yeah,
I think that's totally fair, and yeah, I liked a lot about it as well, and yeah, how the relationships were written, the familial ones, and then relationships with the boyfriends. I agree with you, there's definitely some terrible male characters in there, but not all of them. Absolutely not all of them. I really liked...
Not all men.
Yeah. I really like character that comes in near the end that I won't spoil too much about, or at least has a more prominent role near the end. And then also Zubi as well. I feel like we can't really criticise Zubi, but I mean, Tulu...
Oh, he's so useless, man.
Sexist in every instance he gets the opportunity. Not a fan. And obviously, yeah, Kalu, I think it's the interesting thing of not admitting things to himself because he wants to seem like a good guy.
Yeah.
That I thought was really interesting. And I wasn't sure how they're going to do that. And that was one where I made a guess about what was going to happen. And then that wasn't the case. And I was glad that wasn't the case. I thought it had done quite well. So yeah, I agree with you. I enjoyed it. I think I struggled to get into it a little bit. As I say, I don't know how much of that was maybe I was hoping the book was something different to what it actually was, and then I finally accepted it for what it was and enjoyed it more. Or whether it was a bit slow going or what for me, I don't know. It could also just be a case of how I'm feeling at the moment. I found that I maybe wouldn't have kept listening to this one if I hadn't have been listening to it for this. But I'm really glad that I did have to come back to it for this because, it really grew on me. I really felt the characters were so real. I found it interesting, enjoyable to listen to, and I really liked the epilogue.
So I think that's your lot for our discussion for the first 2 books on the shortlist. The next episode, we will be discussing One of Us and Pride and Prejudice. Thank you so much for listening to the episode. Apologies about my voice. Hopefully it will be cleared by the time we record next time. Thank you very much. Let's say bye.
Bye.